Malcolm Harris is a journalist and author of Kids These Days, Human Capital and the Making of Millennials. This is Malcolm Harris. I'm Duncan Gammy. You're listening to Dunk Tech. Malcolm Harris, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Duncan.
So we're all familiar with the stereotypes about millennials, that we're lazy, entitled, obsessed with avocados. But you actually wrote a book about it called Kids These Days. And, every generation sort of complains about the generation that comes after it. That's as old as time. Why did you decide to write a book about it for millennials, though?
Well, it's not really as old as time. It's really only as old as the baby boomers, and we think of them as sort of the origins of time and all of our traditions, but it's not. We're sort of replaying a generational tension from years past. And what I wanted to get at with the book is what the actual reality of it is, right? Not the stereotypes, not the bullshit, not the stuff that's not true, but what actually is the state of the generation, what actually characterizes the millennial experience, and what characterizes our cohort, and how can we better understand that? Because it seemed like an important issue to me, as well as a way to approach what has been a few decades of really rapid change in America and around the world.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit then about some of those things that are projected onto millennials, like the fact that, or the idea that we're lazy. But in reality, as you talk about in your book, we're working longer hours for less pay and often for no pay. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, how have unpaid internships become such a fixture of millennial life?
Well, one of the things we've seen over the past few decades is a transfer of costs away from the state and away from employers onto workers themselves, and particularly when it comes to the development of human capital. So the older model for how workers get trained for jobs was that employers would train their workers that they hire. They would pay them to learn to do the job that they've been hired for. When that didn't produce enough educated workers, because Americans didn't feel the need to go get those better jobs, more engineering, more science, more math jobs, because the rewards for much less intensive, much less educated work were just fine, then the state steps in and starts paying for Americans to go to college and learn these skills for better jobs. But what we've seen in this cohort is the shift of those costs onto workers themselves and their families. So unpaid internships is a good example of that. That's workers paying, because it costs them time and energy, paying to learn how to work for employers. And we see the same thing with tuition costs and higher education costs in general spiking over these past few decades, which is this transfer of costs onto students who are the workers of tomorrow that otherwise would have been borne by employers in the state. And this is a huge part of what characterizes the millennial generation.
Yeah, there was an Onion article about it. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a fake interview with an older guy complaining about millennials, not getting having the gumption to get jobs. And he's like, back in my day, I went to the boss and pounded my fist on the table and said, "Damn it, I'm the man for the job," and that just doesn't exist anymore. But you mentioned there the cost of higher education, and you write in the book about how we as a generation are hyper educated. Is there what's the problem with that?
Well, the idea for education, higher education in particular, is that you go to school for more, you pay extra money, and you learn skills that then make you employable for better jobs. So it's an investment in your own future labor. You go to school, you learn, you get a better job. This is what we've been teaching kids for, half a century at least now. The problem is when you look at that, excuse me, when you look at that, then this is still true on an individual level. I want to get on the record saying, it's still worth it to go to college because things have really gotten hard for workers who don't have college degrees. The problem is that change is mostly driven by falling wages among people who don't have college degrees, not increasing wages among people who do have them. So what you have on a society-wide level is a bunch of students going to school, spending a bunch of money to improve their skills, which has created this oversupply of human capital that has led to employers in the classical model then are supposed to expand production. They're supposed to hire more people because it's cheap to do so, or because there are a lot available. Instead, what we've seen is employers cutting wages, holding production where it is, and grinding out efficiencies by holding labor costs down or pushing them even down further. So these benefits from education at a societal level aren't accruing. In fact, what we're seeing is them undermining our negotiating position as workers.
Right. And you mentioned in there the idea of education being an investment of sorts in future earnings. I had talked to William Deresiewicz, the guy who wrote Excellent Sheep.
Mm-hmm.
I think he wrote like a blurb for your book, or I'd seen him make a comment about it. But one of his problems was with that idea in and of itself, that the idea that education is an investment and not something that should be valued in and of itself to sort of cultivate the mind. Is that a new way of looking at education? Has this always been the case that people have looked at education purely as an investment?
No, I mean, not really. If you go back to 1965, which is when the Higher Education Act passes, you have a situation in which wages were pretty good for what we call unskilled work, which isn't because it has no skills or whatever, but jobs that don't require college educations. Wages were pretty good. You could get one of those jobs out of high school while you're still in high school, drop out of high school, whatever, and support yourself and a nuclear family in the suburb sense. Now, that's not a problem for the American people. Like, that's a pretty chill situation. If you think about like what your life looked at 18 and what somebody's life looked like, the average person's life looked like at 18 in the 60s, like, it's pretty different. You're less a full member of society now than you would be back in the 60s. However, this was a problem for the American government because when they looked at the number of scientists and engineers that the American system was producing as compared to the Soviet system, which had a centralized procedure for producing scientists and engineers, we were losing, right? This was the era of 4 years before we land on the moon or whatever. This is a serious concern for U.S. policymakers. And so what they do is pass the Higher Education Act, in which the government says, we'll front you the money for going to school. Don't worry about it. Just we need to build up more people with more skills. So it's the government who starts looking at it under this sort of human capital lens first as an issue of national competition, or really system-wide competition, the American system against the Soviet system.
It's interesting because at the same time as the government is viewing it as an investment, back in the 60s, as you were talking about, the amount of student loan debt continues to increase. And I think I read somewhere back in like the class of 2018 has an average student loan debt of almost like 30 grand.
Yep.
What are some of the consequences of people getting out of college and being saddled with all this debt?
Well, I mean, I probably don't have to tell most of your listeners, right? You're USC.
Right.
Yeah. But it makes you like desperate on the labor market, right? It makes it so you're not in a position to advocate for yourself because you have this hanging over your head, and employers, people who will be looking to hire you know that you have that over your head, or at least people like you do. And so they know that they can keep wages down because people are desperate for work because they have to pay back these loans constantly, or the number is going to keep going up. I mean, that interest really does add up. And so that is, I mean, and that's that's just the labor market consequence. Obviously, there are psychological consequences, there are social consequences, developmental consequences. Debt is not good for humans and other living things.
Yeah, I think that's a good bumper sticker slogan. The and one of the consequences that I was thinking of about the student loan debt was that if you want to work a lower paying but more fulfilling job, let's say, a lot of people just can't do it because of their loan debt. Uh, do you think that we should just cancel all student debt?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I mean, my I think we should cancel a lot more things than that, but I think that's a great start.
What in addition to student loan debt, do you have anything in mind that we should cancel as it pertains to millennials?
Well, I mean, the conclusion I come to at the end of the book is that this whole system of value production needs to stop. So we can go down the whole list of American institutions. Um, I think they're really destructive, and we're going to start seeing those bills are going to start coming due to the millennial cohort, and how we deal with those questions of hundreds of years of colonial exploitation, and how we address those bills, like those, they're coming to us now. We're seeing them now, and whether we like it or not, we're the cohort that's going to have to come up with answers for what kind of world we're going to live in.
Right. When you talk about this, looking at people as capital, and looking at particularly at students as human capital to be invested in, um, one of the ideas that you mentioned in the book, you say that schools function like, as it pertains to the amount of homework that students get now. It's gone way up from past generation. You say schools function like the very children themselves aren't good enough without some serious improvements. Could you elaborate on that idea a little bit?
Well, that's a big part of education constantly, right? Is about how do we improve performance. That's been the structuring question of education for a long time, and it's we look at it as experimental. And like you were talking about earlier about it as a education as a liberal pursuit, that's like a totally different thing than what we're talking about under the current system, which is about this production of human capital, which is going to be put to work by employers to the detriment of the people who are, producing that human capital in the first place that we see. So if you're gonna, exploit me, you should at least pay for the skill for me to develop the skills you're going to exploit. Don't make me, race with all the other kids to develop the skills that you're going to exploit later. It's like how Google wants schools to teach everyone how to code. It's like, yeah, of course you want schools to teach everyone how to code, then coders are cheaper.
Right. Yeah, it sounds so so high-minded. Oh, we're gonna teach all the kindergartners how to code and it's gonna be great for them. But really, it's just a way of making it so these skills are so common that you can buy them for cheap.
Exactly, and it's been very effective, and not only so that you can buy them for cheap, but so that you don't have to pay for people to develop them. And honestly, like the skills that they're telling people to develop now, they're like, oh, you should learn how to code this, that, or whatever, telling that to 12-year-olds. It's like by the time those 12-year-olds are 22-year-olds, that won't be fucking good advice, and they don't care.
Right.
They're looking 6 inches ahead of themselves, and people are like raising their children for the immediate needs of the biggest employers, for in the immediate needs of our biggest corporations. And they don't give a shit how that advice is going to work out. They're just looking right in front of their face.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit then about what happens when people sort of make it out of the education system after millennials graduate from college. We're the first generation in American history that's expected to make less than our parents, correct?
I believe you if that's what I wrote.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And that, I mean, it's almost depressing, the fact that uh, that the rat wheel, if you will, the hamster wheel is getting faster and faster with fewer and fewer rewards. Like, you've probably seen all the articles that say, like, why aren't millennials buying diamonds? It's like, because nobody has any money. Um, but let's talk about some of the solutions here. You were involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement, correct?
Yes, I was.
Um, and I was not old enough to participate or really even be politically aware, so I wasn't around. But the media, in many ways, was a response to a lot of the issues that we're talking about right now. But the media sort of portrayed it as this disorganized. You had a lot of pot smokers sitting in a camp somewhere. But what was your experience like on the ground?
I mean, it was both of those things.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I mean, look, a lot of people had very different Occupy Wall Streets. There was a lot going on, and a lot of different ways for people to get involved. And so you could have two people who spent that whole amount of time investing almost all their time and energy that they had into this project, and they could not know each other and have never met and have been working on totally different ends of it. So yeah, there's no like one representative Occupy Wall Street experience, and when people try to, I think, generalize from their experience of it, they tend to sound a little misinformed, like they don't really know what was going on. So I experienced a certain version of it, but it's probably not one that you still want to talk about on the radio.
Why do you say that?
Because it was an uprising.
Right.
we weren't following the rules, and we were planning how to not to follow the rules. And
Oh, I see. You're saying you don't want to talk about it on the radio because you don't want to. You don't want to get in trouble or anything like that.
yeah,
Put
or
anything out.
get anyone else in trouble, or I mean,
Right.
it's hard because you want to protect these historical narratives and have fidelity to what it is you experienced, and you want to be able to like share that with further generations and whatever. Uh, but it's also like
It's
you don't
still
want
very
to.
near to us. I
Yeah,
mean,
it wasn't
happened a
that
couple
long
years
ago.
ago.
Yeah, and the Department of Homeland Security has a long memory, and as do prosecutors. I
Right.
One part of my experience was standing up in a courtroom while a prosecutor read things that I had said out loud to the court as a reason I should go to jail. Um, so like yeah, so I'm a little wary about
How old were
talking
you at that
about
point?
22,
Oh,
23, 22,
man.
23,
I,
2011, yeah, 22, 23.
I can't even imagine how just, I mean, I'd be, that would be bone chilling. But I mean, maybe we could speak in generalities, not about your personal experience. One of the reasons why I wanted to ask is, I don't know if you've seen this going around, but someone who claimed to have been like the founder of Occupy Wall Street is now going
Right.
to
Micah.
Davos, and he's saying he wrote some op-ed talking about how Davos, which is, for people who don't know, gathering of some of the most wealthy and powerful people in the world, and they bandy about ideas, and he's saying, I used to protest these people, now I'm going to join them. Were there like leaders of this movement at the time, or my impression was that it was kind of uh, organic and there wasn't really a head of it?
Yes, Michael White was not the head of Occupy Wall Street.
Okay.
Uh, you heard the saying, if you see the Buddha on the road, you got to kill him.
Right.
If anyone says they're the founder of Occupy Wall Street, they're not the founder of Occupy Wall Street. If anyone says I was the leader of Occupy Wall Street, you got the wrong person.
Right.
Because, look, if anyone wants to know what happened, they can file FOIA requests for the Terror, which is the New York Police Department's surveillance unit, and get the footage because they taped everything.
Right.
So if anyone wants to know what happened in Occupy Wall Street and who was leading what and where everyone was when what went down, they can ask the police because they really do have high res recordings of everything. I've seen some of them.
Well, that was one of the craziest things that came out of that was that J.P. Morgan Chase, of course, one of the institutions that people were protesting against, gave millions of dollars to the New York Police Union, and then, of course, I mean, had the predictable result of cracking down on the protests. Were people? I mean, it was pretty clear on the ground, right, that there were some shenanigans going on with the police. That you had infiltrators and so on. Again, I don't want to get too deep into it if you don't want to talk about it, but I mean that was right there in people's faces, right?
Yeah, I mean, do you know about Hipster Cop? There was a famous hipster cop who
No,
was a cop who was dressed like, back when we used to call the mean thing to call someone was a hipster. With his like tight sweater or whatever, and this he was on duty. He wasn't undercover. The undercover cops all look the same. They're not very hard to spot. Um, and that was like a whole meme or whatever, was hipster cop. So yeah, we knew what they were doing. It's not that like they had to be bribed by capitalists, right? It was like Michael Bloomberg was the mayor.
right.
Um, so when you look at it nationally, we had a Democratic president, and these were mostly protests in cities with Democratic mayors, even though I'm not sure Bloomberg was considering himself a Democrat at the time. But in general, these are cities with Democratic mayors and a Democratic president, who commands the FBI and Homeland Security. And they were not just like ready; they were eager. They were happy to deploy tear gas in all of their main city centers to disperse nonviolent protests. So I think part of what the Occupy movement or sequence was useful for was making that clear what the lines are here and who we're dealing with, and that the police were our enemies. And I think people have a better understanding of that now. And yeah, the movement went in a lot of different directions, right? The execution of Troy Davis is probably not like part of the average Occupy Wall Street narrative, but it was an important part of the sequence in terms of people's like learning during that period.
I'm not familiar with that. What happened there?
Troy Davis was a man in Georgia, I believe, who was executed, widely believed to be innocent, and he was executed. Let me make sure I don't get it wrong.
Please, yeah, no. If you got to Google on the fly. I don't mind.
Was it in September? Right? September 2011. So at basically the same time. And it was a very weak case, and there was a real national effort to halt the execution, and it went through anyway in September, that was 6 days before the official start of the occupation, and a month after we had the first General Assembly.
What were they accusing him of doing?
I think it was a murder during a robbery, I think.
And how did this relate to Occupy Wall Street?
Well, that was a big question, right? And it was part of an understanding of the criminal justice system. And the same police who we were fighting in the street, that they were fighting to preserve the system of capitalism, were also the same people who were arresting black people, on the street in New York for just walking around, and that these were interrelated conflicts. And again, like, it gets written out of the history, but that was a big moment for that group of people, for sure.
I see. So you're saying that in terms of how people in the Occupy movement perceive the criminal justice system, his execution was, although not directly related to Occupy Wall Street, it had a major impact on people there.
Yeah, on people's understanding of the political situation of America. Because Troy Davis is a black man who was murdered by the state of Georgia, sort of in front of everyone, as with this sort of perversion of the state justice system, or what we came to understand, what certain people came to understand as the normal functioning of the criminal justice system.
Speaking of protest movements and political activism, one of the things we haven't mentioned that's facing all of us, but will affect millennials in particular, is the threat of climate change. Having been involved in Occupy, what are your thoughts on groups like the Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion? Do they give you any hope for the future?
I think the people who've been put in movement by them do. I think those particular forms don't interest me much. The Sunrise Movement is very policy focused. They're focused on lobbying the political system. So protest is a kind of lobbying, which isn't really my deal. And the Extinction Rebellion, I'm not sure exactly what I know what their program is. I'm not really with it. I don't really dig it.
Why is that?
I think they rely on some really bad research about how social change happens. That's foundational to them, but was also produced by the State Department. So they have this like fundamental commitment to nonviolence because they think that's how this like research project shows that's how societies change, and it's like I think not just like nonsense, but really harmful nonsense. So I think like a lot of the people involved give me hope, but I hope and I expect that they will be fed up with the insufficiency of the current strategies and tactics pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, that's my perception is, and I may not be as clued into it as you, because I wasn't aware of the fact that they're basing some of their ideas on State Department research or anything like that. But I think it's I agree with you. I think that it's good to go through a stage of trying things at a base level and seeing how they work, and then responding to events and seeing if you have to escalate and so on. Do you think I mean, I don't know how closely you're paying attention to the Democratic primary. Are any of the candidates, in terms of the issues we've talked about today, are any of the candidates giving you hope, or I mean, is it just a list of people to choose who you're going to compromise for?
Well, I mean, it's definitely that. I'm not a Democrat, so I try not to pay too much attention. If I were a Democrat, I would vote for Bernie Sanders, and I'll vote for whoever the Democrats nominate in the general election because I live in Pennsylvania, just like I did last time, and I voted for Hillary Clinton, even though I'm not like a Hillary Clinton fan, obviously.
Right.
So I view voting as very low stakes for me. Yeah, it's not.
No, fair enough.
I don't think any of those people are gonna help us, and I hope they don't kill Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. Hopefully he doesn't get Epsteined.
Right.
But okay, we're almost at the 30-minute mark here. So is there anything you wanted to make sure that you got out there?
Oh, I got a new book coming out in February. Got to plug that. It's called Shit is Fucked Up and Bullshit. That is the title of the book. It was also a sign from Occupy Wall Street that this guy Mickey Smith brought, and he should get credit. A very resonant sign, and that collects what I think is the best of my writing from Occupy from 2011 to now, basically, with a couple long new essays. So if it's out by the time this plays, people should go check that out. Go pick one of those up.
Can people pre-order it, or how do they find this?
Yeah, you can pre-order it from the Melville House site, which is the publisher. There's actually a new book distributor buying place alternative to Amazon called bookshop.org that will have launched by the time this plays. So people should go check it out on bookshop.org and go check out that site too.
Excellent. Malcolm Harris, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Duncan.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you to Malcolm Harris, and thanks for listening to Dunk Tank. See you next time.